Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So today we are talking about the popular art of French cinema, and we are watching a French film. So we're taking a break from our tour of Hollywood. We've been talking a lot about Hollywood the last few weeks, the establishment of the film industry in this country, some of the standards and norms that Hollywood kind of helped to usher in. So we're going to continue to track those, and we're obviously going to return to U.S. films very soon. But I do like to spend a few weeks throughout the semester checking out other national film industries. So we already saw Metropolis, that was a German film. This week, we'll watch The Rules of the Game, which is a famous French film. And then next week, we're going to talk about Latin American cinema. So we'll watch an example of that as well. And then we're going to return to Hollywood and pretty much stay there for the entire second half of the semester. But it's always good to check out films from other places just so we can do some comparisons. We can think about Hollywood's influence on other national film industries, and we can also think about ways that films from other places might influence U.S. cinema, because the influence does go both ways. And France is a good country to sort of study, at least for a week, because they are very instrumental in the creation of modern film as we think of it. And we've already seen that going back to week 1. And also, as the book points out, France's film industry and film history is pretty similar to the U.S. Similar trajectory. Movies are very popular in both places. Both were really involved in the creation of modern movies, the technology, the early innovation going back to the 1890s, and just the way films have evolved is very similar in France as it is here. So if you go back to week 1, you remember some of those very early movies that we watched. Many of them were French. So we talked about the Lumiere brothers. They're often given credit for sort of inventing the ability to project and exhibit movies on a big screen. As we learned, there were other ways to make movies and watch them on like a kinetoscope or one of those kinds of devices where you'd have to put your eye directly to the glass and only one person could watch at a time. And the Lumieres really pioneered modern exhibition methods. They had a camera that sort of doubled as a camera and a projector. So that technology was a huge breakthrough around the middle of the 1890s. So they had that famous film showing in 1895 where they debuted a bunch of their films, and we watched some of them back in week 1. The famous short film of the train arriving at the station. We also saw workers leaving the factory and some other kind of slices of everyday life. As we know, that's what most of their movies were like. They weren't really creating fictional narratives. They were just filming everyday events, and the novelty was simply being able to watch it up on the big screen. But we also saw an early science fiction film, a narrative film from around 1903, A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès. Very famous early example of science fiction as a genre. Also very technically innovative, and an example, one of the first examples we saw of an actual narrative movie that's trying to tell a story, right? There was a script written, there are parts for the actors to play, there are larger themes, a plot that we can follow. We saw that one, and The Great Train Robbery as kind of our first examples of movies like that. So we've seen from the beginning that French filmmakers were very involved in the very early days of cinema, helping to create a lot of the modern techniques of cinema that we still know today. So that's obviously a very important part of their film history, just like U.S. filmmakers were very important during that period as well. So that's part of the similarities that sort of link the two countries together. But also, it's important to note, and I've mentioned this before, Hollywood exports a lot of their movies to other places around the world. So a lot of people in other countries are watching Hollywood movies, really starting as early as the 20s and extending through kind of the end of the silent era up until the point we are that we're in currently, sort of the early sound era. We're still in the 1930s, and then continuing on for more decades beyond. France always imported a lot of Hollywood films. They were not alone in doing that, but they imported more than most. So French audiences always watched Hollywood movies, grew very accustomed to Hollywood movies, and as we'll see, that's kind of important for future developments in the French film industry. They've always had sort of an affinity for Hollywood movies, so as a result, the works of U.S. directors, Hollywood products start to influence French film in the decades to come, and then that cycle kind of continues, but it almost reverses in order, and pretty soon French films would come to influence future U.S. films. So again, the influence can often go in multiple directions. Another way that the French film industry kind of mirrors the U.S. in a lot of ways is what we see in the 1930s. So we've been talking about kind of the state of movies by the time we get to the 1930s. In a lot of ways, we've sort of arrived at what we might think of now as like modern movies, or something closer to modern film, something approaching our definition of what movies sort of are today. Now we have sound, now we've seen some examples of early color films, so features that we sort of take for granted now because they've been around for nearly a century, but as we've seen, early movies did not have sound, did not have color. So by the 30s, we have a lot of the characteristics or traits of movies that we would expect to find today. And we talked about how by the late 30s, Hollywood really is entering kind of a new golden age. They had already had their silent golden age back in the 20s, but by the end of the 1930s, we're starting to enter an early sound golden age. And we talked about the year 1939 as being particularly important because that's the year that The Wizard of Oz came out. Very popular film. Also Gone with the Wind came out, another very popular U.S. movie, also in 39. And The Rules of the Game, our French film for this week, also comes out in 1939. So the French film world was also experiencing kind of a flourishing of artistic expression by the end of the 30s. They also got sound around the same time that we did, slightly later, but by the 1930s, sound had taken hold of most French films, and they had a lot of the same genres over there that we had here. So just like musicals and comedies and melodramas and crime dramas were all popular genres here in the U.S., they were also popular in France. So the book talks about, in particular, musicals, comedies were very important over there. Also, they did something similar to us in that they imported a lot of stage plays, a lot of plays that were originally performed on the stage. They would adapt those to the big screen, to the movies, and would just basically reuse the plots. They might recast, bring in different actors, but same plot, same story. Often they might be adaptations of popular novels or earlier art forms, and they would turn those into movies. But also an important development that happens in France in the 1930s is called poetic realism. And this is a little bit of a break from how French films had been previously. Remember, a lot of what we've talked about in here also applies to the French film industry. So they had a lot of epics, they had a lot of costume dramas, again, melodrama, comedy, musicals, big spectacles that felt really grand and sort of epic in terms of the scope of action, the types of camera work that we saw, the use of music. They had a lot of those same kinds of movies, and they were quite popular. But then in the 30s, this sort of alternative genre starts to develop, and poetic realism is what it would come to be known as. It was probably not necessarily called that initially. That, was applied to the movement later, that term. But basically, this was kind of a more rough, kind of gritty type of genre that wasn't as concerned with like ballrooms or really beautiful costumes and sets. Instead, it was a very different milieu, very different settings and characters. And this genre became popular not only in France, but also kind of indirectly became popular over here too, in a sort of larger stylistic way that I'll try to explain. So a couple of common characteristics of French poetic realism would be kind of a focus on more what we might call working class settings. So unlike a lot of those older epic films that would often center around aristocratic characters, wealthy, important, influential characters, a lot of poetic realism would take place amongst more sort of marginalized people, criminals, people who live kind of on the margins of society, not always criminals, but sort of living in a very different sector or a different sort of social world. So a real emphasis on working class settings, a more sort of pessimistic, cynical tone. Often these movies would take place at night, so there was a very dark visual style. With a heavy emphasis on shadows. Again, these would often be people like in nightclubs or small-time criminals, people kind of operating outside the mainstream of society. So a lot of their activities would be at night. A lot of it might not be legal. Often, again, sort of a cynical, more pessimistic view and a sort of dark visual style that would later infiltrate a lot of U.S. movies. So this is kind of a complex exchange between U.S. and French films, but this sort of dark, shadowy, nighttime atmosphere that came to be familiar in a lot of French films in the 30s started to work its way over to the U.S. in a genre known as film noir. And even the name of that genre, film noir, comes from the French. It actually comes from French film scholars and critics who coined the term after World War II to refer to a particular type of American movie that often featured criminals, people sort of living on the margins of society. They would often be in black and white. They would often be sort of dark, taking place at night, lots of shadows, lots of mysterious goings-on. So a lot of that visual style had been borrowed by American filmmakers from earlier French filmmakers, and it came to be associated with a certain type of American crime drama that became quite popular during the 40s and then continued on into the 50s. And that was a popular genre amongst French audiences. But French audiences were responding to an American genre that had in turn been influenced by an earlier generation of French films. So it gets a little bit complicated, but it was a genre sort of first really noticed by French critics. Again, they coined the name film noir, noir meaning black, so again, like dark, brooding, sometimes violent, sort of nihilistic, cynical, sort of just a more bleak outlook on human nature. The plots were often, sort of centered around crime or, some type of illicit deeds. So this would be a genre that would come to be really popular in Hollywood and abroad in the decades to come. But it does kind of have a French origin, and then later French filmmakers would be influenced by American film noir, and they would start making movies similar to it, but with certain characteristics that were unique, to French culture. So an interesting kind of exchange, not just with that genre, but really just with movies in general. Americans have always kind of been influenced by French filmmakers and vice versa. So it's kind of fun to track that, and you can do it in a lot more detail than I'm doing it right now. So also by the 30s, you have Jean Renoir, who is the filmmaker that we are checking out today. He comes into his own as one of France's leading film directors, and he makes a bunch of his most famous films during the 30s, including The Grand Illusion, which comes out in 1937. These are, of course, the English translations. And then The Rules of the Game, which, like I said, comes out in 1939. Renoir is very famous in France. I don't know that he's particularly famous to most Americans. You might be familiar with his father, Pierre Renoir, who is a pretty famous painter. You might have seen some of his work in a museum somewhere. But Renoir is considered one of maybe the greatest directors of all time, certainly within France's own film industry, but maybe in general. He's often thought of as a real master, one of the early masters of the cinematic form. Certainly not alone. Other great masters were working during this time, but he's one of the big ones. He's one of the giants. And these late 1930s films, the Grand Illusion and The Rules of the Game, are often thought of as maybe his best work. Later, in the 1940s, he would flee Europe as a result of World War II and the Nazis, coming into France and sort of transforming the French film industry. So he escapes, comes to the U.S., and actually makes some movies for Hollywood. Throughout the 40s into the early 50s, he's making movies in Hollywood. He's part of the American movie sort of industry, the machine, much like Fritz Lang, our German filmmaker that we checked out with Metropolis back in week 3. He also came to Hollywood later to make American films. None of Renoir's American films were nearly as successful or popular as his French work. He made several throughout the 40s, including Swamp Water in 1941, The Southerner in 1945, The Woman on the Beach in 1947, and I think his last one in America was The River in 1951. He would eventually go back to France. But like many other filmmakers in Europe, he fled when Germany invaded and occupied, much of France at the beginning of World War II. But this wasn't just something that French directors did. Obviously, people were fleeing Germany, other European countries, because of the Nazis and the outbreak of the war. So keep World War II in mind, because we need to be aware of that event. We don't have to be historians. We don't have to spend a lot of time talking about the war, but we have to realize that by the end of the 1930s, the war is already on. Now, the U.S. has not joined the war yet. We have not come over and started fighting, but in Europe, the war has already started. Hitler has already invaded other countries. He's already fighting with the British and the French and other future U.S. allies. So the war is already happening in Europe. It hasn't really become a reality for Americans yet, but it soon would. Pearl Harbor happens in 41. So by the beginning of 42, the U.S. is fully engaged in the war. But by the end of the 30s, there's a lot of indicators that this war is going to spread. It's going to be even bigger than World War I, which was just a few decades earlier. Renoir fought in World War I. He was a member of the French cavalry. He was actually wounded during the war, shot in the leg, which gave him a lifelong limp. But by 39, there was a lot of signs that, the war was coming. It was going to envelop a lot of people, a lot of countries, and it was going to be very destructive. Really, throughout the late 30s, there were a lot of ominous signs in Europe that major war was about to break out. So this movie is indirectly commenting on that. This movie is very much about sort of a sense of anxiety that comes with the onset of war, but also a sense that big change is in the air, largely because of the war. And things are changing, the world is changing, and a certain class of people, these are sort of French aristocrats that we see in the movie, are becoming kind of obsolete, they're becoming outdated, and their place in the world is no longer secure. So that sense of anxiety, that sense of sweeping change on the horizon is very much a part of the movie, and a lot of that has to do with World War II and the fact that it's really on the way, if not already arrived, at the point that we're in here in the movie. So keep that in mind, because that does matter as far as historical context. So of course, as a result of World War II, the French film industry goes through some hard times in the 40s. They are occupied in large part. But by the 50s, a few years after the war ends, they're back on their feet. The French film industry is back to thriving, producing a lot of movies. They're still importing a lot of Hollywood movies, but they're also making a lot as far as their own domestic production in France. The dominant genres by the 50s had largely become sort of crime thrillers. Again, we can call them crime dramas, largely influenced by the film noir of the U.S. Again, very similar style to the poetic realism of the 30s, but now more focused on vice and darkness. Again, criminal characters often involved in robberies, heists, various criminal activities, or maybe they're trying to go straight, but they're sucked back into a life of crime. Again, stories and characters that would have been very familiar to American film audiences. And again, there's this back and forth influence. That genre really exists in both countries, and it often has a very similar visual style. But they also continued to have comedies. They continued to have a lot of sort of melodrama imported from the stage. A lot of the sort of older period pieces, like sort of costume dramas taken from, historical narratives. That was still a popular genre. So they talk about in the book how France really sort of had a golden age of cinema at roughly the same time that Hollywood did, using a lot of the same genres: comedy, melodrama, musicals, and they were popular throughout the 30s, 40s, into the 50s, and they don't go away, those old genres, but they start to share space with newer, different genres, like poetic realism and the later crime dramas that it kind of gave birth to. And then another big important movement happens in France during the 50s that would be important not just there, but also here. And it's often called the French New Wave. It's a very broad category that includes a lot of well-known, important French directors. And it's kind of a difficult category to define because there's no one dominant genre or particular type of plot that we see in the French New Wave. There's lots of different kinds of movies that get categorized under this heading. What really distinguishes them is certain visual or technical elements. The fact that many of them were made by younger, up-and-coming filmmakers during the 50s. So it's kind of a new generation, kind of a new post-World War II generation. So they're much younger than Renoir, who's still working in the 50s. And a lot of the French New Wave directors liked Renoir. They thought he was good, but they rejected a lot of the other films of that golden age of French cinema that had existed in the previous decades. They sort of rejected a lot of the period pieces, the costume dramas, a lot of the melodrama and musicals, and those types of classical genres that had been popular for so long. They wanted to do different stuff. And sometimes this is described as them wanting to make more realistic movies. I think that's a little bit of a simplification, but by and large, yes. They wanted to create movies that they thought would be more authentic to the lived experience of real people. Not some historical drama from the 19th century, not some big musical with lots of expensive sets and song and dance numbers, but stuff that really captured how people were living during that time in that place. However, that was important to them, but they were also very influenced by Hollywood. They had grown up largely on Hollywood movies. They were watching French movies too, but they watched a lot of classic Hollywood cinema from the 30s and 40s and 50s. So in some cases, they were very influenced by those kinds of movies and how those movies were utilizing certain genres like westerns, like those crime dramas that we talked about. So there was a lot of different stuff all sort of happening at once. But one thing that defined a lot of the early French New Wave is that the films had smaller budgets. So a lot of these directors weren't super established yet. They were young. They were really kind of just getting started. So a lot of their movies were shot on location. They often did not have a lot of expensive sets. They used natural lighting, in some cases even non-professional actors, not always, but some. So it was just a different approach to filmmaking. Cheaper in many ways, but in some ways those cheaper techniques could lead, to a certain extent, to a greater sense of realism or naturalism. They also wanted to do some things a little bit differently in terms of how they filmed. So again, they were often sort of favoring what we might call almost more like a guerrilla style of filmmaking. Not quite, but they were, again, on location. They weren't in expensive sound stages or, indoors like a lot of the classical films would have been. They're out on the streets. They're on location. They needed lighter, more mobile equipment, smaller cameras, the ability to do more handheld camera work, which again struck a lot of purists at the time as kind of amateurish, like not the way big movies would have looked. Big movies would have had a much more sort of formal style that had been established over many decades, but they wanted to do something different. So on location, moving fast, they often incorporated different kinds of editing techniques as well. They sometimes had what we call discontinuous editing. So this was a real departure from how editing had been for a long time. We talked about this weeks ago. Once narrative movies really became the norm by like the 19-teens and certainly by the 20s, we had what we call continuity editing. That became the norm. It wasn't the norm at the very beginning, but once we started standardizing feature-length narrative movies, we decided, for the most part, throughout the Western world, really, that continuity editing was the best way to go because it sort of mirrored real life. So the example I used, weeks ago, if we have one shot of a character with a fork in hand looking down at a plate of food, we would expect the next shot to show us that character eating a bite or chewing, right? We know they're eating, so the next shot should continue that action. It should continue the process of eating. Or we might see another character, but they're still at the table together, right? We know that they're eating, so we expect the editing, the sort of assemblage of all of these different shots, we expect it to follow a sort of logical, sequential order to sort of, create that sense of realism to allow us to suspend our sense of disbelief. But a lot of the French New Wave directors wanted jump cuts, where you wouldn't always go in sequential order. You wouldn't always have a logical progression from one shot to the next. You might see a character doing something in one shot, and then he's doing something totally different in the next shot. So it's like time has elapsed. We've skipped over some things. He was eating before, but now he's getting into the car and driving away. And that was a little bit different. Now we see it a fair amount, but it was considered kind of novel in the late 50s when the French New Wave gets underway. So they were trying some different techniques. They would often have sort of a different approach towards their actors. They would have long takes, so long shots or long scenes that would often feature the actors talking in sometimes a very casual way. There would be some improv, stuff that you wouldn't have found in glitzy studio productions from that time. Again, looking for something a little bit more raw or authentic, something real, but also utilizing some new camera techniques that weren't, and editing techniques that weren't always focused solely on realism, but rather creating kind of a new experience and trying new things. So they also kind of took a different approach towards their screenplays and the stories that they were telling. So a lot of these stories might have been a little bit ambiguous, kind of open-ended, not as much resolution, not following some of the formulas of the popular genres that audiences might have expected back then, where you're going to have a clear-cut hero, you're going to have a villain, you're going to have a sort of happy ever after conclusion. That was the norm in the majority of big-budget studio movies, both in the U.S. and in France. Not always, but largely, that's what you would have gotten. They were trying some different things. They didn't always have happy endings. They didn't always have protagonists that were necessarily heroic or even likable in every way. So things were a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more open to interpretation, which some people liked. A lot of other people were a bit perplexed by it. So not everything was so clear-cut. They were rejecting a lot of elements of classical French cinema, which they found to be boring, really confining, sort of old-fashioned. It's the attitude of young people everywhere when they think about, the films that their parents liked or the films that their grandparents liked. That stuff is old. Right? That stuff is boring. We don't want that. We want new things. We want things that are relevant to our lives today. And again, this kind of goes a little bit back to World War II as well. The post-war world looked a lot different than the pre-war world. So, again, they're responding to very different social conditions, very different circumstances in the 50s compared to maybe what Renoir was capturing back in the 30s, 20 years earlier. So that's part of it as well. But what's kind of funny is that while they're rejecting classical French cinema as hopelessly outdated, old, dull, they really love classical Hollywood. And they just were kind of fascinated by American society in general. They viewed America as this sort of new, obviously compared to France, it's very new, it's very young, and they viewed American society in some ways as having more mobility, more movement, more sort of dynamic qualities than the older European societies that, they had sort of grown up with. So that was a little bit of a part of it, but also they just loved Hollywood movies. They loved that classical Hollywood period, really going all the way back to the 20s up through the 40s and 50s. So that was a huge influence for them as well. Another term that comes to be associated with the French New Wave, and it's kind of important for us because later it would start to be applied to American filmmakers as well. It's the word auteur. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's usually how we say it. And we even have the auteur theory, which really was kind of a new way of thinking about film directors. So remember, this kind of gets going in the late 50s into the 1960s, and it was originally a term coined by French writers and film critics and used for directors from all over, anybody who they thought was a great master. But the idea really came from these French critics and people who were writing about film during this time. So their idea of the auteur was basically thinking, so an auteur is a person, right? A person, particularly a director, can be an auteur. And to be one, it's sort of this process of thinking of the director as being like the author of the film. And we kind of still think of it this way, but before the 50s, we didn't necessarily think of the role in that way. As I've said before, making movies is very collaborative. As we know, there are a lot of different people working on a film set or on a film shoot. It's the director, it's the cinematographer, it's the art director, it's the actors, the production design, the people in charge of costumes, hair, makeup, the actors themselves, the people who scout locations, the people who do the casting. There's a ton of, labor involved in making a movie, and there's a lot of different specialized roles and jobs. Everybody's working together, but as we've said, the film director is often thought of as sort of in charge. They are controlling, or at least in charge of, a lot of that creative process. Other people are involved, but the director is kind of the boss. So that was the idea, but there was always an emphasis on the collaborative nature of the filmmaking process. But by the 50s, what a lot of these French thinkers were coming up with was thinking of a film as a little bit more art and less big business, and the idea that the film director, by virtue of being in charge of everyone else, really was sort of the author. They were the most responsible for the finished product. And they started to argue that the great auteurs, the great film directors, had their own unique styles. And you could tell, like John Ford was one of their favorite American directors. And they wrote about him a lot, talked about him a lot. He was famous largely for his westerns, often featuring John Wayne, other famous actors of the time. And they would argue that, John Ford is an auteur. When you put on a John Ford movie, you know right away that it's John Ford. He has a signature style that comes through visually. It comes through in terms of sound design. It comes through in terms of how the actors perform, the story that's being told. On all levels, this is a John Ford movie. Now, they wouldn't deny that the camera work was actually being done by the cinematographer and his camera operators. The sound mixing was done by somebody else. The editing was done by somebody else. John Ford wasn't literally doing all of the work, but it's his style. It's his sort of unique artistic creation. Yes, all of these people are contributing, but they're all working for him. They're all following his artistic vision, and they're helping him to express it. So it's kind of the way we still talk about film directors. We often sort of give the director the overall possession of the film. That's his film. That's her film. She made it. But of course, we know she didn't make it by herself. She had an entire crew. She had an entire creative department. She had a whole cast of actors doing the work. But it's her artistic expression. It's the director's work. And that's increasingly how people started to view directors, not just over there, but also here. And again, part of what a lot of these French critics, and some of the critics also made movies, part of what they did, it was they rediscovered some great American directors that had already sort of been forgotten over here, or maybe they didn't always get their due. The French sort of rediscovered them or celebrated a lot of them and got them to be popular not just in France, but back in the US where they had originally been working. So again, it's kind of a fun process of borrowing what we could sort of think of as cultural exchange between the two countries. But some famous examples of French New Wave movies. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just to give you a few titles and directors in case you want to learn more. Breathless is a really famous one by Jean-Luc Godard. If you watch Breathless, you're going to notice a lot of the key characteristics of the French New Wave. It's some of those technical elements that I mentioned, the discontinuous editing, jump cuts, some of the different visual things that they were experimenting with on location shooting, sort of long improvisational scenes between actors. All of that's there. Very innovative, technically, visually, and it was just thought of as a really cool movie when it first came out in 1960. Its use of music, just the way it looked and felt, the performances of the actors, the two leads, who both went on to be very famous. One of the leads was actually an American actress who worked in France and spoke fluent French. So it's just a really well-known movie, famous, influential, but if you watch it and you have some knowledge of American film noir, that genre I was discussing earlier, you'll see that Breathless is indebted to American movies. I mean, it would not exist without American crime dramas in that film noir style that in turn was influenced by an earlier genre of French movies. So the way the main character behaves, he's kind of an anti-hero. That's very much a trait of American film noir. The shadows, the use of light, the style of cinematography, very much indebted to American film noir. Even the story, the actual plot that unfolds, the sort of criminal element, very much connected to film noir. So it's almost like an homage to American film noir. If you guys are familiar with that term, it just means like a celebration of this other genre. They loved American film noir. They really did. But when they sort of adapted it or used that style, they were also making some changes, adapting it to French settings and the realities of post-war France, and just kind of having fun with it. While they were paying sort of homage to the genre, they were also sort of making fun of certain traits, sort of having fun with certain, plot devices, certain elements that would have also frequently shown up in film noir. So this is why the French New Wave is sometimes thought of as kind of metafictional or self-referential, if you guys know what I mean by that. And again, that would become popular in American film later. But it's just this tendency of a movie to sort of call attention to the fact that it is a movie, and to call attention to its influences, to sort of wear those influences on its sleeve. I mentioned the film Scream a couple of weeks ago, or maybe that was last week, when we were talking about genre and how eventually certain formulas of film genres become so standardized, so common and familiar, that later movies within that genre can sort of have fun with those genre conventions, with those certain expectations of the genre. You can even have characters in the movie commenting on the nature of horror films. And that's kind of what the Scream franchise really specialized in. And people like it. It's often played for laughs. It can often be sort of a comedic device. But the whole idea is the genre is so familiar, it's so popular, that now that you're making an example of that genre, you can comment on the genre. You can talk about the genre as you use it. So that's self-referential. You're referencing what you're doing. You're referencing your own influences, your own techniques, you're calling attention to that stuff. Whereas more traditional, older movies would not have done that. They would have maintained the illusion, right? They want the audience to take all of this as real. Whereas self-referential, metafictional films kind of play with genre. They call attention to genre. They call attention to their own artificiality in some ways. And they're having fun with it. They can make it funny in some cases. In other cases, they're just sort of celebrating the movies that they like. And a lot of the audience members like those same movies. So it becomes a process of, oh, I get that reference. I get what he's calling back to. He's gesturing towards some famous American movie that a lot of the audience members would have seen. So it can be fun as long as you feel included. If you get the references, if you're celebrating the same kinds of movies that the maker of the film is celebrating, if you're kind of on the same page as the director, it can be very fun, and it can almost feel like you're kind of a part of this exclusive club. You get the references, you understand the influences, but if you're not a part of that club, if you're not familiar with what the director is commenting on, if you haven't seen a lot of other movies in that genre, if you haven't seen that Humphrey Bogart American movie from the 1940s, then the reference falls flat for you. You're not really in on the joke, and it can be a bit alienating for some. So that's why I didn't pick Breathless. That was one reason. It also comes a little bit too late in our chronology, because again, it comes out in 1960. We're still in the 30s, so I didn't want to jump that far ahead. But that's a really famous example of a French New Wave movie that really embodies a lot of what the French New Wave was supposed to be about. Some other examples, Shoot the Piano Player by Francois Truffaut. Truffaut is one of my favorites. I think he's the most accessible of the French New Wave directors, meaning you don't have to be a film scholar to watch his movies. He's fun. He loves film noir, just like a lot of his contemporaries. So Shoot the Piano Player is basically an homage to film noir, American style film noir. Very much like sort of a gangster movie, sort of made in that style, but it's also funny. So Truffaut is using a lot of the conventions of these types of crime movies, and he's turning them, in some cases, into kind of absurd comedic situations. In other cases, he's taking it seriously, and that movie's fun because at times it's funny, at other times it's suspenseful and tense. So that's one thing Truffaut was really known for. He could really shift registers and tones kind of seamlessly, sometimes even within the same movie. It's funny right now, but then later it's going to get kind of tense and suspenseful. He could do that because he was a master of a lot of different genres. Another one by him, Jules and Jim, which comes out in 1962. So a lot of these best French New Wave movies were coming out at the very end of the 50s and the very beginning of the 1960s. And Truffaut was an example of somebody who wasn't just an auteur. He was a great film director who also wrote many of his own scripts. See, that was another part that kind of mattered to them. In order to be an auteur, it helped as a director if you also wrote your own screenplays. That way, you had control over the story and the actual shooting of the movie. Whereas if you were adapting somebody else's screenplay, or if it was a famous novel or play that you were adapting to the movies, it's not your story, right? You're working with somebody else's story. So they thought the best way to be a true artist in a cinematic way was to write your own screenplays and then direct those screenplays. And Truffaut largely did that. Not always, but he wrote a lot of his own scripts, and he loved American movies. He loved classical Hollywood movies, and he adapted or imported a lot of those ideas, styles, But he was also a writer. He was also a film critic. So, in addition to making movies, he was also watching a ton of movies and writing reviews on other people's movies. American movies, other French movies, German movies, British movies. He wrote about Alfred Hitchcock. He wrote about John Ford. He wrote about Howard Hawks was one of their favorite American directors, kind of a B-movie specialist of Westerns back in the 30s and 40s, had largely been forgotten in America by the time Truffaut and them come around, but they loved Howard Hawks. They thought his Westerns were great and really sort of modern in the way they were shot, the stories they told. Again, a little bit rougher around the edges, not the same kind of sort of optimistic, pro-expansion sort of messages that you got in a lot of other popular Westerns. Hawks' Westerns were kind of weird, a little bit different, so they loved him. So Truffaut wrote about those guys. He later would write a book about Hitchcock and some of these other sort of, important, influential directors from throughout the Western world. Hitchcock was a Brit. He loved a lot of Americans. So he wasn't just a director. He was also kind of just a thinker and a writer of film. He wrote reviews. He wrote what we would think of as like film scholarship. He wrote it's almost like academic papers about film. He studied film in addition to making films of his own. So he was a really important voice. Died young, but had a really prolific career. And if you're interested in any of this stuff, particularly the French New Wave, I would start with Truffaut. He's a great way to get introduced to the larger movement. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about the rules of the game. So we're not watching anything from the French New Wave. That might be a little bit of a shame. But again, it happens later. We're still in the 30s. And I wanted to show you guys a real classic just because I think it fits in, really, with a lot of the other movies that we've already seen. Again, we can see how a lot of these French movies are similar to some of our movies in terms of style, scope, just, the visual achievements, the technical achievements, and what we are seeing and hearing on screen. But also, the rules of the game is just regarded nowadays by a lot of scholars as one of the best movies of all time. So, and again, regardless of country, right? Just talking about movies in general, it is considered one of the best. So I know what your initial reaction might be. When you first open up the link or first go to YouTube to find the movie, you're going to notice that, yes, it is in French. So you're going to have to read subtitles. So that might turn you away. That's like the first issue you might confront. You'll also notice that it's in black and white. And you'll notice, of course, it's very old. So these are usually things that are held against movies. You might notice those characteristics and think, yeah, I don't want to watch this. I'm not really going to get this. It seems too old. It seems too foreign. I don't want to deal with it. But give it some time. If you're a little bit patient at the beginning, I think you'll be surprised. It's not a hard movie to follow. You will have to watch subtitles unless you can find a dubbed version. I wouldn't recommend that, though. Just deal with reading subtitles. It's only a couple of hours, and they're pretty easy to see and read. So once you get past some of that initial strangeness, I think you'll find that the plot is pretty easy to follow. It has some funny moments. It's pretty compelling in terms of how it looks, the way it's shot. I think it feels pretty modern, and it is considered to be a masterpiece. So what's interesting about that, though, is as great as it's considered now, it was not very well received when it first came out in 1939. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of the big reasons is that Renoir is really sort of criticizing the sort of upper aristocratic classes of French society. But a lot of people at the time felt like he was sort of criticizing French society more generally and just sort of pointing out a lot of problems, social, cultural problems that were about to come to a head with the outbreak of World War II. And the way a lot of scholars read this movie, the way they sort of interpret it, is that what's happening with a lot of these characters, the sort of chaotic state of their personal lives, is really meant to echo or mirror this huge change that's about to happen throughout Europe. And this is, I think, sometimes a little bit hard for American audiences to relate to because we don't have the same kind of history, the same kind of class divisions that you find in a lot of older European societies. So a lot of what we see here is sort of the death of the old aristocracy, right? These old rich families. And you would have seen this in France, in Germany, in England, a lot of older European nations that, of course, have longer histories than we have as a nation here. And they always had more stratified class positions compared to what we had here. So you had these old, very wealthy, powerful families that often owned a lot of land. You can see how these characters live, right? I mean, this is a very lavish setting, very beautiful mansion. You know, they have all this land. They can go out and hunt foxes and, you know, they have really nice things. So we see how they live. We see how separate they are from like regular people, right? So this is an aristocratic segment of society that had been around for a very long time, had always been very influential, powerful, and they're sort of dying out, is the message that a lot of people think Renoir was trying to get across. With World War II coming and rapid modernization coming, these people, these aristocrats, are sort of becoming obsolete, right? They don't work, like they don't really have jobs, they don't do a whole lot. They live off of family money. They pursue pleasure. They pursue their hobbies, their interests. They're obviously pursuing a lot of extramarital affairs in this particular movie, but they're not really doing a whole lot in terms of day-to-day production. They're not really involved in modern forms of economy or even, you know, the political process. So the idea is their time is up. And World War II, for all the terrible things that it would bring, it would sort of usher in a period of modernity, right? Sort of new things, new developments, and these old aristocrats would not really have a place in that more modern world. So that's often what's thought of as the theme kind of at work here, the larger theme of the movie. And again, it was thought of as an important message, not just in France, but really throughout Europe and much of the world. Not so much here. We'd never really had an aristocracy here, but in older societies, a lot of the same stuff was sort of playing out. So it was thought of as really capturing, the movie was really capturing a particular moment in history, a particular moment in time that was very important. In terms of the genre of the movie, we could probably call it a comic melodrama. A lot of this is being played for laughs. It's intended to be humorous. You might laugh at a few scenes, a few lines, or you might not. You might not find it terribly funny, but you can see how at least some of it would have been received as comical at the time. But also very much a melodrama in terms of heightened emotions, improbable plot developments. Like we were talking about with the melodrama genre last week, stuff that we would still kind of recognize today because we still have the genre. It's changed and evolved quite a bit over the last century, but we still have a lot of these elements. We might find them in soap operas. I would argue reality TV has filled a lot of these gaps. We get a lot of aspects of melodrama in reality TV, like confrontations, again, like improbable events. Somebody who we thought was lost is like back. Secrets are revealed, relationships potentially get fractured, a big emphasis on interpersonal relationships, often of a romantic nature. So we still see a lot of these traits in popular shows and movies even today. But back then, a common thread of a lot of melodrama in both America and France would be upper class characters. And this was kind of a holdover from older novels and older plays from the stage, where these types of melodramatic narratives would often revolve around aristocrats. Wealthy people with a lot of time on their hands. They have beautiful clothes, they live in beautiful homes, and they have a lot of time to cheat on their partners and get into all kinds of intrigue and deceit and have these kinds of big dramatic plot developments. So we see a lot of that in this movie. A lot of the plot really does revolve around the infidelities of several upper class characters. Christine, Robert, who's the Marquis, Andre. Now, Andre kind of has a different background, right? He's not a born aristocrat. He's trying to enter this world through his courtship of Christine, but he's not like these other characters. He actually does work, he has a vocation, and he's become popular through his own achievements, which many would say, again, makes him very different from people like Robert or Christine, who were just sort of born into this world and have always inhabited it. So keep that in mind. He's sort of different. He's a little bit of an outlier, and in some ways he doesn't entirely fit in. But also, Genevieve, Octave, who's played by Renoir himself. So Renoir did act a little bit. He was mostly a director, but he plays Octave. He's a character that you might get to know and like a little bit. And again, he's somebody who often sort of comments on the lifestyle of the rich and the prosperous, but also trying to sort of get in on that lifestyle himself. But we also notice that what the upper crust characters are doing and all the sort of, various circumstances they find themselves in, all the sort of deceit and sort of questionable moral judgment that they exhibit is also kind of mirrored in their servants. So aristocratic characters like these would have had a lot of servants, and we see that in the film. There's kind of two layers or two levels of characters, right? We see the aristocrats, and then we see the servants who work for them. And they have their own intrigue. They have their own melodrama in the servant quarters. So we see characters like Lisette, Marceau, Shoemaker. Those are all sort of servile positions, right? And this was part of what needed to change, right? This really stratified society where you had aristocrats up here, you had, people in the middle, and then you had this whole servant class that really didn't have a lot of freedom and equal opportunity. They lived their lives serving the aristocrats, but they get up to their own trouble here, and they're doing a lot of the same things, a lot of the same antics that we see with the aristocrats we're also seeing with the servants. So a lot of critics took that to sort of mean that in this world, everybody's been sort of corrupted. All levels of society have been corrupted, and we need change. We need reform, and like it or not, World War II is going to bring that on. So again, these wealthy upper classes, they're rapidly becoming obsolete, and in the post-war world, they really would be. Stylistically, the film is known for a lot of different visual elements. So one thing that gets talked about a lot is its use of deep focus cinematography. So that just means we have a very large depth of field here. There's a lot of things visible in a lot of the shots, a lot of the scenes that we see in the movie. So we often have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, all visible. They're all in focus. That's what deep focus means. We can see all three levels. What's right up close to us, what's in the middle, and then what's further back. We have that sort of deep field of vision that allows us to notice more. It allows us to catch things that maybe in some cases characters are not aware of, and it just kind of creates a more rich immersive atmosphere where we really feel like we are there. Another thing that helps with that is something that at the time was very ahead of its time, very complex: the sound design of the movie. If you notice, particularly in that opening scene when we're at the airport, we often have a lot of different sound sort of happening at once. And this is true throughout the movie. You'll often have a lot of different people talking at the same time. So we'll have different threads of dialogue, sometimes over ambient noises, like the crowd at the airport. Later, we hear gunfire during the famous hunting scene, right? So we have all these different sources of sound. We hear people talking, but there's also a lot of ambient noise. And then we also, in some of the interior shots, some of the interior scenes, we have a lot of characters talking all at once, often speaking over one another. So we have kind of overlapping dialogue, very densely packed soundtrack. When they're having the big party, think about all the different things you're listening to. You hear dialogue, you hear screaming, there's more gunfire, there's music that's actually being performed in the movie. Diegetic movie. It's in the fictive universe of the movie. It's being performed during the scene in the movie. So we hear that. We hear, I think at that point, Shoemaker is shooting at Marceau. So we hear music. We hear guns. We hear a lot of people talking. That might seem normal today because a lot of contemporary movies have a very similar kind of densely packed sound mixing or sound design. But back then, we're only about 10 years into sound movies. It was really ahead of its time. It was quite innovative, what they were able to do with sound, very influential. Also, they had very expensive sets. One of the most expensive sets in French film history, which again makes sense because they're trying to capture this really opulent, lavish lifestyle. And the place itself, the home itself, it's like a sort of, almost like a medieval castle. The type of place where these sorts of aristocrats would live and gather and socialize. So really beautiful sets for the interior shots, anything we see indoors. Pay attention to set design. And then finally, the costumes often stand out. You would expect nice clothes, opulent clothing for a class of people like this. So the costumes were designed by Coco Chanel, who was French. The final thing I'll mention, just going back to Renoir a little bit more and the reputation of the movie. Like I said, when it first came out, it was poorly received. France was entering into a sort of wartime state. They were also occupied. So a lot of the French public wanted patriotism. They wanted stuff that would make them feel really good about being French because they were going through a lot of hard times. And the way this movie was interpreted, like I said, it was kind of thought of as very critical, not just of the upper classes, but really traditional French society in general. It was viewed as kind of cynical, kind of mean, making fun of a whole class of people and really sort of undercutting maybe a sense of national unity. So it was so poorly received that Renoir actually tried to re-edit it. He tried to kind of create a newer, shorter version that audiences might prefer. So he tried to cut out some of the scenes that people seem to especially dislike. And a funny thing to note is a lot of those scenes happen to include his character, Octave. So he cuts a lot of the scenes of Octave out. In fact, he cut so much out of that newer version that it changed the whole plot. He eventually cuts out the part where we see that Octave intends to run away with Christine at the very end. I won't give more away, but you'll see once you've watched the movie, that changes, taking that out, changes really the whole ending of the movie. Entirely changes the ending, and like the final sort of like message, you might even say. So it's altering the plot. It might also be altering some of the themes and almost cutting this character out. But even then, the sort of octave-free version that he tried to give to audiences was also unpopular. It was just really never successful, really during his lifetime. It would happen later. Really not until the 50s would sort of a later generation of scholars and new filmmakers like Truffaut would sort of rediscover it. They would create a new restored version, kind of more faithful to the original, and it would become much more appreciated later on. But in 1939, when it first came out, there's a famous quote. It was banned in France briefly. It was actually banned from theatrical showing, and the official reason given by the government was that it was, quote, depressing, describing the film, depressing, morbid, immoral, and having an undesirable influence over the young. So that was the way a lot of people thought of it when it first came out. Again, it didn't have a unifying sort of positive message, and a lot of people held that against it. But once we got some distance from the war, and it wasn't so much all about, being patriotic, people started to appreciate it more as a great cinematic achievement. And I'll just leave you with a final quote about Renoir from Pauline Kael, a famous American film critic and scholar. She says that the reason Renoir's films still resonate with us, and she was saying this back in the 70s, but I think it still applies today. She says the reason his movies work so well for any type of audience is because he's expressing the beauty of our common humanity. All of the desires, hopes, and absurdities that everyone shares. I'm paraphrasing her quote, but that's essentially what she's saying. He expresses something universal. Our common shared humanity. Desires, mistakes, hopes, the absurd situations that we get into. There's something universal about it. So even though this is a very French movie capturing a very particular point in time, it's universal. I think we can appreciate it. Give it a chance, and we can experience some French film before we get back to Hollywood. But actually, next week, we'll continue our international tour, and we'll check out Latin American cinema. So let me know if you have any questions, if you're having any issues accessing the film, and otherwise, I will see you next week.